Welcome to the Prelude Talks. The Prelude Talks are a bespoke online series that lead towards Headspace 2018, an event in March the 2nd and 3rd in Trinity College Dublin, which presents scientific and creative investigation into the determinants of a healthy brain. So the speakers are ambassadors from diverse disciplines. They indicate the territory of Headspace 2018, which has twin ambitions. One of approaching complex issues with innovation, and two, of seeking knowledge from a diversity of expertise to bring fresh insight to enduring challenges. So they're designed as a growing online archive, and currently you can find Kate Goodwin on Sensing Spaces, Sir Michael Marmot on the social determinants of health, David Cottrell on the limits of empathy, and future talks include Alice Thwaite on her work with creativity and older lives. What connects them, diverse though they are, is that in their own practice, each speaker examines the relationship between information gathering, decision making, and delivery. They operate across systems of knowledge and understanding, and they're often wrestling with how that knowledge is formed and articulated, sometimes how power is engaged with and systemic bias countered. So we've invited each of them to talk at what we call the edge of their comfort zone, so that we might go and stand out with them. And so today I'm delighted to welcome Felicity Callard, as Professor of Social Research and Director of the Birkbeck Institute for Social Research on the Social Self. Felicity, welcome. Can I just put this here? And then I'm going to sit down.
Thank you so much for that invitation, Dominic. I'm a social scientist, and in the last few years I've been working in collaboration with life scientists, particularly neuroscientists, psychologists and artists and humanities scholars, so historians and literature specialists, to think through some of the key questions that we believe need to be addressed across disciplines. And so today I'm going to be talking about a project that I directed called Hubbub, which is a project that addresses rest, the phenomenon of rest, in neuroscience, mental health, the arts, and the everyday. What I'm specifically going to be talking about is rest in the brain, though, as I hope will become clear, actually to understand what is going on in the brain at an experiential level, you can't just do it with neuroscience. And so the fundamental premise of the talk is, what might it mean to bring a whole range of disciplines together to think about how what is going on inside the mind can only really be addressed by bringing an awareness of the social world and other kinds of expertise to try and get at what the brain is doing. So if we think about a lot of cognitive neuroscience operates with the assumption that to study the brain, you have to give people various kinds of tasks, and then you try and assess the activity of the brain when they're doing a task in relationship to when they're not doing a task. So if you were to go into a scanner, many experiments to this day, in between each task that you're asked to do, a memory task or a perception task, that will be interspersed with this single fixation cross that is, or at least was, for cognitive neuroscience, something profoundly not of interest. It was just something that you were asked to look at, and it was assumed to be the other side of cognition. And it was called, there was the assumption that this was the brain and the mind in the resting state. Now, if you look at that cross yourself, most of us, within a short while, will find that we're doing all sorts of things whilst we're looking at that cross. And much of what will be happening will be a complex relationship to your own internal world. So the intriguing question that became greatly of interest for a number of neuroscientists in the last decade of the 20th century was how to try and get a grasp on what was happening when people were looking at this fixation cross. So hold that in your head as we move towards a wider discussion of rest. So if we think about the question of rest, and rest is a concept that spreads enormously widely. It relates to body, it relates to social conditions, who is able to be at rest. Classically, states of unemployment or idleness were referred to as rest. And it is also a curiously underdefined term. So if you look at the definitions provided by the Oxford English Dictionary, rest is usually defined as something that isn't something else. So it's respite from labour, respite from exertion, leisure, idleness, inactivity. And so to actually get a grasp on rest, and I mean this both in relationship to the body at rest and also the mind, the brain at rest, what has happened a lot of the time is that people have looked at the opposite of rest to try and get at rest. And if we think about rest too in terms of questions of health, which this series is exploring in relationship to aging, rest is commonly something that is prescribed, thought to be good, but at its heart it also remains deeply underdetermined. So many clinicians to this day prescribe rest to people, but actually what is meant by that, who knows? And as many of us will also know, that actually enforced rest is often profoundly the most unrestful thing that one can experience. So this was the starting point of this study. I was deeply intrigued by the notion of a resting state that wasn't really being fully investigated by the cognitive neurosciences, and also deeply interested by the prescribing of rest as something that really no one had a grip on. So we put together a project and were lucky enough to be the first inhabitants of this interdisciplinary space funded by the Wellcome Trust in London, particularly within Wellcome Collection, which is a building incorporating a wonderful library and archive. And this space, an apparently neutral space, not owned by any particular discipline or set of expertise, was a space where we came together to start thinking about how to get a grip, or at least elucidate some of the questions around rest that we were interested in. So, as we started the project, we started thinking about different scales of inquiry, and on the screen you can see these shorthands going from the social world, what does rest look like at a social level, economic level, down to the brain. I would stress that I'm in no way suggesting that you can actually separate brain, mind and body out from one another. This is just a useful heuristic. And then we were also trying to bring together different kinds of expertise to investigate those rest at different scales. So both from neuroscientists, psychologists on the one hand, and then really bringing in a whole range of people working in film, broadcast, poetry, history, to start opening up some of those assumptions about rest. Before I return to the question of the brain specifically, it's worth noting that at any one level, it's virtually impossible to give a definitive account of rest. So physiologists to this day, a body at rest, what is the resting state of any organism, is subject to ongoing scientific debate. I mean, arguably we are only really at rest when we are dead. when the organism is no longer in any kind of living state. So rest is a very complicated term. And if we think about it historically too, one of the collaborators that we were working with, Aisha Nathu, was looking at the really interesting way in which rest and relaxation actually separate out from one another. So at a certain point in the 20th century, there were various initiatives that actually were trying to teach people to relax, because simply resting did not mean that you were relaxed. So again, you start to see the complex ways in which what is going on in the body is not necessarily what is going on psychologically or experientially. And these are some of the rather wonderful photographs that Aisha Nathu was working with about people being taught certain kinds of practices around relaxation. And her argument too is that a lot of the current Western forms of mindfulness are actually built on the back of earlier 20th century techniques about ensuring that the body is taught how to relax. So again, if we have all this complex historical and cultural background in our minds and return to the point at which I started, which is the question of the resting state in the brain. And I hope in the rest of this talk to make an argument that really emphasizes that to make progress with understanding the brain, we need to work much, much harder at how to get at psychological accounts of how the mind is experiencing things. And I think that many cognitive neuroscientists would agree, I hope they would agree, that whilst there have been huge, huge strides made in terms of understanding brain networks, actually relating brain networks to what is going on experientially, that task is still a massive task in front of us. So rest and the brain, rest in the mind. And for the next quarter of an hour, I'm going to try and explain why I think this is a really interesting topic in terms of debates around health and illness and the brain. But first of all, a bit of scientific background. The traditional cognitive neuroscientific account of how to get at localized brain function is a model in which you subtract activity during a task. You subtract what the brain is doing when it is apparently resting from what it is doing when it is doing a specific task. And this is a simple slide that tries to summarize that. So you get someone to do a particular task, you're interested in that task, you subtract the average brain activity during the task from condition B from condition A. And so the implicit assumption is that the brain is more active when it is doing something. It's more active when it's doing the memory task than when it is looking at the fixation cross. That was the assumption. However, at a certain moment in the last decade of the 20th century, that assumption started to break down. And there was a very important paper that was published in 1997 that, rather than looking at all the activity in the brain during tasks, was actually able to see that there were parts of the brain that were consistently more active at times of rest than when doing the cognitive task. And this broke the kind of paradigm that suggested that all parts of the brain were going to be less active in the resting state. The big question was how you actually account for what is going on. Why are parts of the brain more active in the so-called resting state? This is a very long and complex scientific story, deeply indebted to the research of Marcus Raichle. And the the long and short of it is there were very complex metabolic arguments that looked at the enormous amount of energy that is used by the brain at states of rest. But also there were psychological accounts that started working out that when the brain is apparently resting, when we are not doing an externally focused task, there's an enormous amount of psychological activity that is linked to, and here we see the 2001 paper, linked to things like self-referential mental activity. So thinking about our own preoccupations, thinking about or engaged in states of mind wandering or daydreaming. But what I want to really stress as someone who, I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm a social scientist and someone who's interested in the history of these phenomena. What's important to realize is that the initial finding was a brain-based finding. So there were these serendipitous findings that showed that there were parts of the brain that were more active. And then the task was, how do you actually come up with psychological models that explain that? So there was a gap produced. And the question to this day is, how psychologically do you get at what is going on when these brain networks are active? And I don't think that that has yet been resolved. So back in, I think it's almost a decade ago now, in one of the collaborations that I had with a cognitive neuroscientist in the emerging field of resting state cognitive neuroscience, we started really pulling apart this kind of change in paradigm, because it really was a challenge to most of the models of how to think about cognitive function. And this comes from a paper that we did together, which is now rather old, thinking through this. So this was a moment when we thought that there was a new paradigm emerging. It now is absolutely in place. And if we look on the left-hand side, the old paradigm was driven by the assumption that brain function is largely determined by extrinsic activity. We are reacting to what's in the world outside us. And there's a whole host of other assumptions that play into that old paradigm. In the new paradigm, there was much more focus on how a lot of brain function is actually being determined by spontaneous activity. And a lot of the ways of investigating that, the methods were not clear, how you actually get at really finding out about what that spontaneous activity is doing. Because in the older paradigm, there were all these very, very precise cognitive tasks that you could give people that would allow scientists to discriminate how people were responding to the task. How on earth do you scientifically investigate states of daydreaming? How do you get someone's internal world into the world outside? How do you collect data? The other thing that I think is really important to notice is that from the start, these claims about the resting state were large claims. So 2001, when the paradigm starts to shift, you start to really see some large assumptions about the default mode of the brain in some ways being tied to very fundamental ways in which we are human. The default mode, the resting state, is a core part of how we are actually functioning. And as you start to see the paradigm kind of rolling out, these are two quotations that are attempting to try and address the significance of this new model. So two very prominent neuroscientists: exciting discoveries about the resting human brain raise the question of whether we are gaining the novel capacity to measure quantitatively our most intimate and unique inner selves. Are you most you when you're racing through work, doing a task, or when you're simply sitting in a chair, mind adrift, just being? Or Marcus Raichle, who has been so central to the development of the entire field, the brain's default mode of function serves as a master organizer of its dark energy. Over time, this dark energy may ultimately be revealed as the very essence of what makes us tick. So you can see that intrigue about what this default mode is doing. And I think that this is a moment where it becomes really important to see the difficulty of moving between understandings of brain function to what is going on psychologically. Making that link, coming up with the experiments that would allow us to understand that link, has produced, I think, some rather unfortunate sets of assumptions that I think we need to be very wary about. And I think it goes back to the question that states of mind wandering, states of daydreaming, states of self-referentiality, because they are so difficult to get at, it's very easy to make normative claims about them. So if I picked out three really I think interesting examples of how these assumptions have travelled badly. So back in 2005 there was a neuroscientific study that suggested that the default mode network seemed to have some kind of relationship to what is going on in states of cognitive deterioration. Unfortunately, when that rolled out into the press, you start to see headlines like "Daydreaming Brain linked to Alzheimer's," with the consequence that somehow then people are thinking, if I'm daydreaming, does this mean I'm going to get Alzheimer's? The study was saying nothing of the sort, but you start again seeing this very rapid series of normative claims being made about what's happening in the brain, and then what's happening in daydreaming, and that's going to be really bad because it will then lead to cognitive deterioration. Scientifically, the study was not claiming this. Later on, there was another prominent study published that seemed to indicate that people who they collected data of whether people were mind wandering or not, and within the confines of that small experiment, it suggested there was some relationship between mind wandering and being less happy. You then started to see this proliferation of accounts that daydreaming and mind wandering might make you really unhappy. Roll on, 2017, and you start to see newspaper articles that says that daydreaming and mind wandering is linked highly to levels of creativity. Now, what is going on here? As a social scientist, it's clear to me that inner life is an extraordinarily complicated thing. The terms themselves, mind wandering and daydreaming, are themselves incredibly umbrella terms. And if you go right back to the start of where I started the talk, that fixation cross, I'm sorry, you're going to have to edit this out probably. If we look at that cross, or we start not focusing on that cross, the states of mind that we are going through are enormously varied. Some of us might be ruminating obsessively with feelings of guilt, or kind of returning to thoughts again and again and again. Some of us might be engaging in all sorts of other kinds of activity that would be much more free-flowing. So the inner world is an incredibly diverse space. But I think the problem was that because there was this open moment, these brain networks needed to be explained, and there was too rapid a sort of series of assumptions made about what this internal life was. So you start seeing very strong arguments that either something, daydreaming or mind wandering is bad or it is good. In the last few years, scientists have done an enormous amount of work actually to start breaking down different states. So we start getting a much more nuanced set of accounts of internal life. So if I just go back to... So we've got this opening set of scientific questions that clearly demand that researchers with expertise at understanding the internal world need to work alongside those who are exploring the organisation of brain networks and brain circuits. And this was a moment where I and various collaborators started thinking, okay, how can you put together different kinds of research teams that would bring that varied kind of expertise together to start working out what is actually going on in this problem space. And one of the hunches that several of us had was that this term mind wandering was doing an awful lot of work and was carrying certain sets of assumptions in its wake. So where we started off is a few years ago, is starting to explore what was happening as all the research on the resting mind and the resting brain, all that science was being also driven by, we felt, certain kinds of psychological categories that were being used to explain what the brain is doing during this so-called default mode. And so we searched the literature and looking at a range of terms that might be used to explain what we are doing when we're not apparently doing much at all. And from this graph, and I checked earlier this week, and the graph continues in the direction that you would imagine since 2012. What is really interesting is that many of the terms kind of bump along. There's no particular growth. So these very psychological terms like spontaneous thought, task, unrelated thought, there's a little bit of bumping. But what is really noticeable is that the term mind wandering at a certain moment in 2010 really becomes the term that dominates the scientific literature. And even more than that, it becomes the term that we argue allows this big engine of cognitive neuroscience that you see on the pull-out in the lower half. A huge amount of research is going on within cognitive neuroscience, but it is also the default mode network and mind wandering that are starting to be pulled together. So the brain research is tying together networks in the brain, default mode network, and a particular model of mind wandering to generate this engine that keeps on going. You'll remember, I hope, that I started off by saying that cognitive neuroscience was very used to working with tasks. People are given tasks, external tasks, that they have to respond to. And that caused problems because mind wandering you can't really give someone an external task because mind wandering is precisely something that happens in the absence of a task. But because of that historical set of assumptions about how to explore the mind, there was for several years, I think, far too close a relationship made between tasks, not tasks, and the not tasks being this kind of mind-wandering state. This is quite a complicated slide. I'll try and go through it slowly. So the way in which the science unfolded was a way that really established this incredibly close link between mind-wandering research and research on the brain network, the default mode network. And so there was this implicit assumption that there was a particular brain network, the default mode network, and a particular kind of experience. So the default mode network kicks in when someone is not doing a task, it highly activates, and that means someone is mind-wandering. The problem is that that model that emerged didn't remotely do justice to all the varieties of internal life that don't immediately adhere to a simple doing a task or not doing a task. If we think about our own internal worlds, probably as you are listening to me now, there's a whole complex way in which you might be, the task might be that you're listening to me, but you're simultaneously probably spinning other little fantasies, thoughts of what you need to do later on. So this whole task, non-task division is in some ways far too simple, and the assumption that the default mode network gets active and then mind-wandering happens is too simple an assumption. And so what we claimed in this earlier research was that this kind of easy divide between task networks and external tasks, default mode network and mind-wandering was it was a kind of folk psychology. It was far too simple a way of tying the brain to the mind. And in the last few years, we've been trying in a variety of ways to contribute to the international endeavour to get a bit more of nuance into this debate. And if we look at, this was a very important scientific article that came out in 2016 that by Christoph and colleagues. If we think about, and the slide that she has produced, if we think about all the kinds of spontaneous activity that our mind is doing, it can range from highly kind of ruminative and obsessive thought to incredibly untethered reverie type activities. Simply putting them in this one umbrella term, mind-wandering, confuses that territory. So what a lot of scientists and clinicians are constantly asked is, when people see headlines like, well, daydreaming is bad or daydreaming is good, it doesn't make any sense because daydreaming can mean so many different things. Often for people who have a diagnosis of ADHD, lack of attention might be incredibly difficult and cause all sorts of problems, but lack of attention in other ways might be causing all sorts of, that's the space where a lot of us do our most creative work. So the challenge that scientists and others have unfolded is the only way to make progress with really understanding what is going on in the mind during most of our lives when we're not responding to an external task is to get better at methods for actually investigating internal life. The problem is that the disciplines that we have, or the legacy of the models that we've used, haven't made it that easy, because all of the energy has gone on focusing on understanding how people respond to external tasks. We haven't got that good at exploring spontaneous worlds without the external task. So, a quick summary of where the field, which is a multidisciplinary field, has got to. Whereas at the start of the talk, I made clear that that fixation cross used to be the other side of cognition. It was seen as a brain just kind of idling around. The resting state was not an interesting state. In the course of the last decade or so, the resting state has been transformed into an extraordinarily complex, coherent, productive state. And mind wandering, models of mind wandering, it used to be seen that mind wandering was not goal-oriented. Now a lot of the psychological models of mind wandering say that actually when we're mind wandering, we are achieving goals. We're achieving different kinds of tasks. I don't know what you think, but again, I would say that the term itself is so heterogeneous. Some kinds of mind wandering might be achieving a task, thinking through what I need to get in the supermarket, but other kinds of wandering thought are far, far less goal-oriented. So again, the term is still covering up an enormous range of heterogeneous experiences. And that central question remains, how do we elicit and capture, kind of investigate mind wandering to understand what is actually happening during those resting states? So one of the things that my collaborators and I have been doing is actually saying, okay, the cognitive psychological literature in the late 20th century was not particularly good at doing that. But actually, there are many, many other fields that have been incredibly attentive to trying to describe and anatomize internal worlds. We are sitting in Dublin. Modernist literature is again and again held up as one of the most nuanced and finely grained accounts of daydream and internal life, in terms of really thinking through what it means for the mind to move in both determined and radically undetermined ways. How can we make use of the resources of literature to think about how to get at that moving mind? Again, there have been many other historical scientific attempts to investigate mind wandering and other kinds of states. So in a recent study that I've been doing, in collaboration with a neuroanatomist, a cognitive psychologist, a sociologist, a historian, and me, we've been, again, trying to bring together different sets of expertise to model mind wandering differently. And one of the central premises is, what would it mean to, as we call it, reopen archives from the humanities and the social sciences that give us other resources to try and understand our complex internal lives. We're in the midst of actually going through the data from an actual scientific study that we have run, so I'm afraid I can't tell you the results of that. But one of the premises of that experiment was we actually used methods of phenomenologically driven interviewing to try to allow participants different ways to account for their internal lives from the ways that are usually used in lab-based experiments. Again, if you think about your own untethered thought, the difficulty is that as soon as an attempt is made to get you to actually convey that, it disrupts it. And even if you are in a laboratory experiment where you know that suddenly you're going to hear a bing, that in itself will also probably disrupt the phenomenological experience of actually allowing your mind to wander. So that is what we are grappling with. Some philosophers, some historians, some social scientists will say, and I'm very sympathetic to this approach, that actually we will never get It's impossible to get a kind of pristine account of internal life because, again, it is always going to be a mediated experience. We cannot even narrate to ourselves where our minds have been a lot of the time, which is a huge scientific challenge. In the last few minutes, I'm going to talk about another element of this interdisciplinary experiment on mind wandering. So I said that one of the premises of this project is opening up other archives. So, for example, we've been collaborating with a medieval historian, Hilary Powell, who is looking at how mind wandering was written about in texts that are dealing with how monks control wandering minds. There's a very, very rich archive of descriptions of how the mind functions when it is wavering all over the place. And the thing that I am doing myself is trying to build what I'm loosely calling a daydream archive, which is an archive of different accounts of daydreaming and mind wandering. I don't know whether they will ever be of any interest to scientists, but I think that it is very, very important that we do actually think much more creatively about how to try and get at the contents of our internal worlds. Again, to turn specifically to the question of health and psychopathology, I said earlier on that it's deeply problematic, I think, to make strong normative claims about mind wandering and daydreaming, saying it's either healthy or not healthy, because the experience is so profoundly heterogeneous. And again, if you look historically, it really, really shows you how diverse the assumptions are around whether, how, and in what situations states such as daydream reverie are seen to be supportive or undermining of health. Again, if we think about where daydreams and mind wandering has been investigated, they are places that are where people should be doing or being certain kinds of people. So we have studies from the clinic, different kinds of psychiatric, psychological studies, but also the factory, because of course, if we go back to assumptions around productivity and labour, daydreaming is precisely that which gets in the way of being properly productive. So there's a great interest in the early 20th century how you try and address the fact that a lot of people on the factory line are spending a lot of the time not actually attending, and what are the consequences of that. And again, the school. Is daydreaming helpful or undermining of educational growth, becoming a good citizen? Very quickly, in the remaining couple of minutes I have, I'm going to give you a very, very quick indication of some of the sources that I'm looking at that provides other forms in which people have investigated mind wandering and daydreaming. So Cyril Burt, one of the most famous 20th century psychologists, in his early work collected these extraordinary daydreams of school children, and this is in Westminster Jews Free School. And you could argue, is this a daydream? He's clearly been asking the children to write down their daydreams, and you see these extraordinary sentences. One day I imagined that I was on a border ship sailing to the east or to Palestine. Is that a daydream? Where does the divide between a school child's story and a daydream and a reverie happen? And again, this fascinating instance of a child who just says, I don't daydream. Again, there's something, if we think about the wonderful world of the daydream as that which actually is something private. There's something quite violent about scientists and I include myself as a social scientist, trying to extract daydreams. And I often think, is this child, by saying I don't daydream, actually protecting that internal world from the one who wants to pull it out of don't know whether it's a him or a her. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, apologies.
Shall I do?
No, that's
Just carry on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm actually going to skip through that because I'm on 43 minutes. Is that okay? The second very quick example is by the writer Marion Milner, who later on in her career became a psychoanalyst, one of the very important British psychoanalysts. And she, in her writings, over many years, tried to actually experimentally investigate her own thought. I decided that I would begin by a study of my wandering thought. When I did begin to try and find where my wandering attention had been to, I found it none too easy, for this free-drifting thought was a shy creature. If I did try to watch it too obviously, it would scuttle away into its hole, only to appear again as soon as I turned my head the other way. And she tries all sorts of techniques, some of them indebted to Buddhist techniques too, of creating states of mind that would allow her to track her own thought as it escapes. Again, are there any resources for us now to try and get at subjective experience that would actually enrich the kind of scientific models that we have? David Rapoport, a very prominent 20th century, mid-20th century psychologist, psychoanalyst in the States, in his archive. Again, these are in some ways marginalized materials, did a whole host of experiments where he would try and put himself into states either just kind of coming out of or going into sleep to try and catch his daydreams. There are similarities here to, again, kind of modernist attempts to, whether it's automatic writing or other attempts to try and catch thought on the move. 20th century, late 20th century psychiatric and psychoanalytic work, Ethel Spector Person, who again tried to operationalize daydreams. She created a daydream questionnaire to try and get young people to account for their experiences of daydreams and fantasies. One of the founders of the scientific field of daydreaming research, writing in 1968. This was the first attempt to produce robust knowledge about extent of daydreaming in different kinds of groups of people, very much driven by the assumptions within social science of that time around the immigrant story. So this rather disturbing and bizarre slide that we have in front of us, he attempted to gather material from different groups where they would report on frequency and content of daydreaming. And the order of frequency that one of his famous studies revealed had a complex relationship to people's immigration status. So the daydream or the fantasy, for those people who are more secure in their status as an American immigrant, the German, the Anglo-Saxon, there is less need to daydream. Whereas one's state as an African American or an Italian, the immigrant, the levels of discrimination were much, much, much greater, and therefore one's status compared with where one would like to be actually, according to his theory, would produce increased rates of daydreaming. So Jerome Singer was one of the first people actually to start looking at age and tracking daydreaming states across age ranges too. And it seems very, very clear over the last few decades that older people, as we get older, we tend to daydream less. Though again, let's bear in mind, if I'm saying that these terms are very capacious and they're operationalized differently, do we have robust knowledge? I'm not quite sure we do. Okay, because I'm aware that I'm going over time. Have I got just 2 or 3 minutes? Okay. So I've run through a whole range of what I hope are interesting questions and remaining things that I don't think that scientific investigation can get a grip on. There's been an enormous amount of progress scientifically in actually producing really sensitive experiments that try and investigate lapses of attention and states of mind wandering. But I remain convinced that science alone is not really going to give us a coherent account of these states. But what I do think is happening is that within the scientific literature, we are seeing the gradual breaking down of that problematic divide that I explained earlier on, that just made a very simplistic division between on task, doing a task out in the external world, and off task. So scientifically, there's much more of attention to how most of our waking life are in states that move in a very complicated way between different kinds of external and internal tasks. It's also becoming clearer within the scientific literature that you cannot just say that if someone's default mode network is highly active, that means that they are mind wandering. There's a much more complex account of the brain that relates the default mode network to other networks and has much more complex relationships to the psychological life that is going on. And there is an acknowledgement that we need methodological innovation in what scientists called self-reports and what I have called people trying to convey their internal experiences. So again, that question of how we can continue to use different kinds of resources, whether in the historical archives, in fictional archives, in other forms of knowledge to understand the quality of internal life. I think that's going to become increasingly important for scientific work around understanding brain function. The default mode network is very unlikely to support simply one function. It's no longer possible to say that the default mode network is the network for mind wandering. Just before I finish, and again I would stress I'm not a psychologist or a cognitive neuroscientist myself, in relationship to aging, as I've explained before, studies consistently show that when people are doing external tasks, their default mode network is deactivated. So that kind of like there is some kind of seesaw, even though it's become much more complicated than it previously was. The data are complicated, but what seems to be the case is that older adults do have lower levels of mind wandering when they are doing attention tasks, but they also have attenuated default mode network deactivation. So again, it suggests a much more complicated set of things that are going on in the brain and the mind and in our phenomenological experience. And there is huge interest at the moment in thinking about what happens as we age in healthy and less healthy ways, and the role that mind wandering and daydreaming, the role that those states play in it. So the older that terrible headline that sort of associated daydreaming and Alzheimer's, I hope those kinds of very simplistic assumptions are no longer in place in the general press. Finally, everything that I've talked about has been an enormously collaborative endeavour. So I feel that I'm speaking as an I, but I'm actually speaking as a collaborative group. And some of the work that the collaborators with whom I'm lucky to work, some of that work appears in these 2 volumes that are open access, so can be read online. And finally, these are some of the many, many people who have helped me think in better ways, I hope, about the complicated relationship between our brains and our minds. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you so much. That was fantastic and interesting, and lots that is relevant to what we're trying to do with Headspace, but also to the Global Brain Health Institute, partly the issues of working across existing disciplines, partly the limitations of models and metaphors. So it was really rewarding to hear you talk about engaging with that in such an interesting way, but also the contextualizing of it historically was really kind of valuable. Do you want to?
Okay. Again, more a response than a question, but just finding some of that fascinating coming from a drama or theatre point of view, and of some of the work that I would do, say, with students, precisely to get them to not, say, plan and write, or to, I teach improvisation, for example, is one of the things, of not feel they can't stand up until they've written a play in their heads, but what are the starting points that get someone to jump in and discover and shape something as they're discovering it. But I was interested again in, it's happened with some of these talks of the implications in the language that's used. So even the word narrative and what's assumed when people talk about narrative, the value judgments that are in the world. So the child that you said says, wrote, I don't daydream. You wonder how much that child has been told, stop daydreaming. Yes. So to what extent, and when you were talking about the study where the more successful in societal and educational terms in America, of the less daydreaming and the sort of racial configurations that were coming as a result of some of that thinking. And again, that sense of, well, daydreaming's not good, is it? So to what extent are people reporting something which, mind wandering, I try and do something, but my mind's always wandering, as if it's a negative. And yet in my work, for example, it's how to induce the state which allows the mind to wander, because the task is to what if, the task is to imagine, the task is to that create the idea that springs to mind. So just really interesting to look at some of within a field where it's an actual positive. Yes. In relation to looking at that. And then I wondered maybe this in terms of on task and off task. It is a question really, is what you mean by task. At one point you said, for example, a memory task, when you were talking about extrinsic and intrinsic, the two comparisons there. And I wondered to what extent are we completely in the field of what is constituted as a brain task by the scientists, and thinking of the mind-body link-up, that, for example, if I want my mind to wander, to be free to roam, I might sweep a stage or wash the floor or do the washing up or do some ironing, precisely to let my mind wander. And to what extent in the production line that you mentioned, is it not so much that productivity suffers from mind wandering, but considerations like safety or quality control, because actually the mechanical task can be done absolutely while the mind's wandering.
Yes, absolutely.
But it can't be monitored while the mind's wandering. And so the workers' monitoring of their own task on a production line goes out the window, because the body will do, but the mind's gone off wandering. So I could say other things, but these are just some responses. Within the theatre world, I think of Stanislavski and the notion of emotion memory and things precisely to trigger a memory because of what you will then discover in that world of memory. That also crops in as a form in reminiscence theatre. Or of Laban and the working actions, where the very notion of dreaming is, it's floating, it's that notion of something which is indirect. And so your very body language when you're talking about the focus on task, the direction, the goal, the very use of the word goal,
Yes.
as opposed to discovery,
Yes.
of wandering with an O as opposed to wandering with an A, is I wonder.
Yes,
you know?
I thank you so much. I mean, I think that every part of what you've said is so rich in terms of opening up how limited the debate has actually been about mind wandering. I think you're absolutely right that the problem is that task, the psychological task, as it has been conducted in laboratories, has so overdetermined all the discussions. And what became really interesting to me as someone who works historically, I was thinking there have to be lots of pieces that have been written about the role of the psychological task, that there hasn't really been work done on the history of psychological tasks. But from the small amount of historical research I have done on that question, it is tied to not economic models, but it is tied to labour tasks. So actually controlling labour and then modelling tasks in the laboratory have a kind of, they are brought together. But that then really, really over-privileges certain kinds of being in the world that completely cuts away most of how most of us spend every day, where we are not being, well, a lot of the time, even if we're doing an external task, as you say, the factory line, there is still an enormous amount going on so that the actions can be, the task can be completed. Other internal world things are happening, but all the focus has been on that external task. So to me, it's a sort of odd situation that task, and of course, you know, our world is one in which we're meant to be, you know, increasingly meant to be accomplishing tasks. But it is also a moment where you start to see the discourse shifting. So again, I haven't done this systematically, but in terms of the press, there are many more instances in which there are, you know, daydreaming is good for you. So it's almost as though, and I think it has a complicated relationship to the literature on sleep too, that sleep has now become something that previously one could boast that one only needed 4 or 5 hours sleep, and now we're seeing some, in certain, obviously in not everywhere, but now there's more of a sleep and daydreaming are actually crucial to allow both body and mind to continue to be healthy and creative.
What I'd call percolating. When you do something, you say, now go away and let it percolate, and then we'll work with what occurs to you or what comes up later. And some of the instant, the move in education, or in our field here in third level, are within Trinity, for example, of let's have all the exams, the assessments straight after the teaching term. Whereas for us in theatre, it's let's do a performative moment and then allow some time for the different levels of reflection, one which might be visceral, one which is emotional, one which is, and then the stepping back from the experience and the ability to reflect, and the whole notion of let's take some distance from that.
Yes.
And now a different sort of educational model being saying there shall be no distance, and things will be organised, and the task will be wrapped up.
Yes.
So it's sort of what's that value of time in all of these things. And sorry, one other thing would be the very word dream, because when you showed us the children's writing, again, I wonder to what extent it is that child's dream to have the house full of rugs and their mother be there. And we use the word dream as something that can generate goals. What is your dream? Well, then that's worth working for, isn't it? And so dream is used. You know, now you can get your dream home, your dream job. I dream of that. Well, let's go for it. And then this notion of daydreaming being in the world of mind wandering but nighttime or sleep dreaming being in, and you'll learn a lot about your life. If only you could remember your dreams. So that this sort of presence of the notion of dream in the way that we speak of it and experience it, I think is very telling in the material that you're showing us there as well.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know. Thanks very much. They're really thought-provoking. I now want to read The Restless, whatever it is. Oh, and one last thing, sorry. Stanislavski and relaxation. So many theatre people where, in terms of process, one of the first things you do is that notion of the body, of working on relaxation so that the person is present in the space enough to then be sparked off by what's happening, rather than the mind be absent or the mind be elsewhere. What does absent-mindedness, what does that mean?
Absolutely, and I think that what you're getting at too is that very complicated relationship between body and mind. And of course the difficulty that cognitive neuroscientists are fully aware of is that, you know, most of these studies are done in extraordinarily constrained, unrelaxed environments. I mean, the fMRI studies, being in a scanner is one of the least relaxing things you could possibly do. So you have a lot of lab studies that are preoccupied with task. You have a lot of fMRI studies that are putting people in scanners, and then you're trying to get at these complex states of distraction, absent-mindedness, in situations that are entirely unlike those that we commonly inhabit. But your example from theatre too makes it also clear how much training or certain kinds of habitual practices are necessary to hold either the body or the mind in ways that will allow other things to unfold.
Yes.
So,
and the very use of the word embodied. So that we would work quite a lot, say, with the people devising group-created theatre or devised theatre, to make sure some of that is what we call on the floor, i.e. embodied. You're not just thinking and talking and using materials you've brought to work it out in your heads through thinking it through. Part of it is to get up and work in an embodied way with materials or with ideas, and then see what that produces, and then take. So it's this stepping in and out of.
yes.
It's like getting out of your head in one way, as well as being concerned about the link-up.
Yeah.
One last question. You don't mention music. You mentioned writing, film, but nothing about music. And is that deliberate?
No, it isn't. In fact, there's a conference. I don't work on music myself. I know that there's a conference happening, again, somewhere in Germany, can't quite remember where, which is on mind wandering and music and imagery and rhythm. So there is great interest amongst musicologists and scientists.
Because it would be something like a remembered hearing a piece of music or smelling a remembered smell are like very common triggers if you're looking at that takes my mind back to when.
Yes.
But also that sense that it's not word-oriented or thought, and therefore the ability of the mind to wander in when listening to music. Anyway, thank you very much.
So I had one question which was really around, so one of the things that we think about in the Global Brain Health Institute is what constitutes a healthy brain, what is a well brain, and I guess that crosses over into your work in some ways, so, and it's linked to what you were talking about in terms of productivity and being useful, and I just wonder whether you might talk around that and how that has appeared.
My real discomfort with too quickly labelling any kind of activity as either healthy or unhealthy. And I think that one of the real challenges of this interdisciplinary debate around mind wandering and daydreaming is that we actually know so little, because I think we're so mired in what you've pointed to, that so many of the debates are still mired in assumptions around, you know, what a school child should be doing, what we should be doing to be a good, productive subject. And so I think that certainly scientifically, it's far from clear, saying people should mind wander more or less, to me makes no real sense, because it's impossible to prescribe certain kinds of mental activity. Or I think what this literature points to is how varied daily life already is. I mean, I think that, to me, that sense of saying one should at work, daydream for 10 minutes a day between, breaks, and that to me seems trying to lock down something that is just far more complex. I mean, I think that there are clearly huge problems in terms of how we organise workplaces, how we construe activities that are not seen as productive. I think there's still an enormous societal horror on the part of a lot of people about if you are not actually contributing to the creation of economic value, that somehow that is not valuable. So I think we're still really, really struggling to overcome a whole weight of assumptions around idleness, laziness, that kind of get in the way. And I think that, for me, what would be wonderful is if the ongoing scientific work on mind wandering really starts to get us to think much, much more carefully about the assumptions we make about what we should and shouldn't be doing, let alone what is healthy and unhealthy. But we're in a world where there are growing attempts to get people with people trying to claim disability benefits, social security benefits, having to do more work to actually receive those benefits. So this, we're living in a world where work is valorized enormously. At the same time, we're living in a world that is increasingly saying that most of the jobs are going to be disappearing. So I think what counts as work and what counts as not work is under enormous pressure at the moment. So I think, my interest in mind wandering and daydreaming, I think, is hoping that we really, really think carefully about work and idleness, and really start to challenge some of those pernicious ideas about valuable or not valuable activities.
Fabulous. I'll stop there, I think. Thank you very much. Felicity Callard, thank you so much.